It's my pleasure to facilitate this next panel. Beg your pardon. We also took the liberty of changing the title. We did inform everybody, but the panel title we felt was a little bit more reflective of the materials we wanted to cover. Was about building resilient urban communities. The previous title we were looking at emergency management, and that has some connotations about how we actually deal with emergencies as they occur. And in talking to the panel before we all came here, looking at some of the themes we wanted to explore, we thought it was better to perhaps rephrase the panel into this building resilient communities, because I think it's important to look at how a city, how an urban area prepares itself for an event, whether it be an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever. So we have changed the panel, the title, but we have not changed the members of the panel. So it's my honor to introduce my colleagues here on the panel. First up, we have Arietta Chakos. Arietta is a public policy advisor on urban disaster resilience. She currently works on crisis management and community multi-sectoral engagements here in California with a lot of the cities and the regional authorities. Her work within San Francisco, Palo Alto, and many of the Bay Area agencies and private sector firms focuses on strategies to improve urban resilience and infrastructure systems themselves. She was a project director at Harvard Kennedy School's Acting in Time Disaster Recovery project. The second member of the panel is Mary Comerio. Mary is an internationally recognized expert on disaster recovery and a member of the UC Berkeley. She joined UC Berkeley Department of Architecture in 1978 and served as the chair of the department between 2006 and 2009. As an architect, she has designed numerous public and private facilities, including market rate and affordable housing. Her research, however, focuses on the costs and benefits of seismic rehabilitation, in particular housing, post-disaster recovery, and reconstruction. She is the author of The Disaster Hits Home, New Policy for Urban Housing Recovery. In 2011, she also received the Green Star Award from the United Nations for her work in post-disaster reconstruction in China and Haiti. And the third member of our panel is Jayant Kalagnanam. He is a senior manager in the Mathematical Sciences Department at IBM, Watson Research Center, founding research director at the IBM Research Collaboratory in Singapore, and is focused primarily on smarter cities. He graduated from the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and since joining IBM in 1996, Jay has worked in developing analytics and optimizations-based decision support systems for enterprises and smart cities. So our panel here, please give them a warm welcome. So this issue of resilience, emergency management, post-disaster recovery, unfortunately, seems to be quite a timely issue. What we're going to do in this panel is we're going to have a lot more of a dialogue on three key areas. What happens, what do communities, what do cities need to do to build resilience plans? What exactly is a resilience plan? What's in a plan? What do we need to consider? And how does that plan then create a dialogue and a leveling of creating an environment that allows a city to prepare its citizens and its operations to act in an appropriate manner during an event? We're also going to then look at post-disaster. What gets rebuilt? How does one assess the impact on the community? How does one rebuild in a sustainable, smart area so that these ideas go back into the resilience plan for the future? And thirdly, we're going to look a little bit at technology. We're going to look at how technology assists us, how it needs to assist us in this area. So these are the areas that we're going to have the panels discuss. So I'm first going to ask Mary really to kick off the panel. And as we've seen throughout, the past, just a couple of years, we've seen Fukushima, we've seen Indonesia, we've got earthquakes that have devastated significant parts of Auckland, flooding in Europe, flooding in Australia, a huge impact in Haiti, earthquakes all the time. There seems to be, from the outside looking in, there seems to be a lot of activity on naturally the recovery, but we don't get to see much activity. There's not much of a dialogue about planning for these events. There doesn't seem to be many examples of where we're seeing communities benefit from a good quality disaster plan. So can you just give us a few examples of any of the pre-planning for current events that we're now seeing in the world?
Well, there's a great deal of work that's gone on in California, really, after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and which was followed by, a year later, by one in Japan in 1995 in Kobe. So those events really triggered, if you will, the idea that we really need to think about the next one and to think and prepare for those. So in the Bay Area, alone, we've had the East Bay Municipal Water District building a redundant line around the East Bay Hills, understanding that their water lines cross the Hayward Fault. We've looked at bond issues for seismic retrofitting of the BART transit system. So there's been, and every bridge in California has been retrofitted by the state Department of Transportation, Caltrans. So all of these efforts actually add up to a huge amount of work in terms of planning for or being more resilient. But I think Arietta will join me on this. I think we're now starting to work with cities to really think about what does it mean beyond just the infrastructure to develop some degree of resilience. And it includes things like making sure healthcare is going to be functioning and available. You're not going to lose every hospital in your region. That you will have the ability to restore the infrastructure and the power and the gas and all of those things, that you will think about housing, you will think about other public services, and you have to put time frames on those. Once you make those, a city thinks about those things, then you can start to look at, okay, where are we now and what do we need to do to get there? And Arietta might want to, if I can pass it to her, she might want to chime in on that.
That's really true. After, especially in the Bay Area, after the 1989 earthquake, community members really started to wake up and be aware of the tremendous physical risk that we face here in California. In Berkeley, for example, I had lived in this community for almost 30 years, and I became aware of the fact that our local schools were seismically unsafe. And I started to reach out and actually contacted Mary at the School of Architecture and other experts in our community to find out what sort of planning cities and school districts and neighborhoods had to do in advance of a disaster to make sure that they could weather whatever hit, whether it was an earthquake. Here in the Bay Area, urban wildland fires are much more prevalent, actually, than earthquakes and have caused tremendous damage over the last 100 years. So it really starts with an awareness of what the risk is. I was mentioning to the some of the members of the previous panel that I loved hearing about their imaginative use of data sets and looking at big data to try to solve urban problems. And I felt like I'd walked into the wrong meeting, because usually the meetings I would go to, I worked here in Berkeley as assistant city manager and with our local school district as well, we were had our noses to the grindstone trying to figure out, how do we make buildings safe? How do we work on putting together infrastructure systems that will weather flooding or big fires or earthquakes? And how do we do that ahead of time so that we reduce the risk to human beings, so that children can be safe in their schools, so that we can be in meetings and not really worry about the kinds of damages that we see in earthquakes, such as the Haiti earthquake and the devastating earthquake and tsunami in Japan. So there has been very little work done, for example, to look at the efficiency and efficacy of reducing risk ahead of time. And in the United States, there's been one sponsored study by the National Institute of Building Sciences that showed that for every dollar invested before a disaster in risk reduction, whether it was for fire safety, earthquake safety, or what have you, it saves $4 in post-disaster recovery and response costs. And that's a fact that really doesn't really migrate into city planning discussions or the work that, you know, a number of state and federal agencies engage in on disaster readiness. So resilience is really the topic of the moment. It's sort of the new sustainability in both city planning and city governments around the country.
Well, if I could just add one thing to that, because it's those of us who work in the area of earthquakes, and in California we spend a lot of time thinking about them. You know, a new LEED certified sustainable building isn't very sustainable if it falls down. And so we've got to kind of get this safety issue that Arietta is talking about in or it's, you know, so damaged it won't fall down maybe, but it's so damaged it's going to cost half again as much to repair it. I mean, we need to cross the silos, as it were, and make sure that sustainability and safety and all of those issues are kind of a part of that urban planning conversation, and they're not sort of in separate compartments as if we only deal with the emergency when it happens.
So on a very practical level then, when we look about building these plans, resilience plans, can you just give us a sense of who's actually involved at a city level, at a regional level? I mean, whose authority is it to build these plans? And use California as an example if necessary, but I'd like to get a sense of how big is the stakeholder pool here, and whose ultimate responsibility is it to build these plans?
Well, I can start a little bit. I have to say it's no one's responsibility, actually, and it's everyone's responsibility. One of the things that we're seeing here in the United States, and probably most of the developed nations, is that for so long we've really just focused on emergency response. It's sort of like we acted as if we were emergency room physicians waiting for people who were very acutely injured, and we would take some action at that point, or they had reached a point with a chronic illness that they couldn't go on. And in a way, that's the sort of situation that we find in city, state, and federal governments in the United States and central and provincial governments in other nations. So basically, communities have seen the utility, for example, of putting together emergency response plans. A fire starts, we send out fire trucks, we put fire retardant or water on the fire, and it's out, you know, the event's over. But those sorts of issues become so much more complicated because of the interconnectedness of all of our systems, especially in urban areas. I was saying at lunch today that if I were a typical city employee from any city in any country, I would have come to the morning's lightning talks, and my big takeaway would have been that, oh my God, look at all of those visuals. I don't really understand what those people are saying, but I see that all of these systems are connected, and a failure at any node in any system has cascading impacts. So city officials have started to see that being ready just to put out a fire is simply not enough in a very complex metropolitan region. Mm-hmm. So what's happened in the United States, for example, at the federal level, is that the National Research Council and the National Academies of Science and the President's Office of Resilience at the White House have been looking at this issue of how to build resilience, how to ensure that no matter what sort of disruption happens to a community or a region, that area and its inhabitants, not just its citizens, but everybody who lives in a community, can be able to weather that event, bounce back in some way and engage optimistically in a future that is before them. And that's a very different reality from recovering from a significant flood or an earthquake looking like Haiti, for example, or like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So the notion of resilience has become a very big topic in planning circles and in policy circles in ways that really haven't maybe filtered down to city governments. One very significant exception in the United States on the West Coast is San Francisco. The city of San Francisco became very involved in the recovery of New Orleans after the hurricane and flood, and saw that it was very fragile, as New Orleans is and could be after a significant disaster or earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. So it started this new approach to both integrating resilience and recovery planning with emergency response. And this has been, you know, a sort of uneven effort, and both the mayor and the city administrator have been very deeply involved in this. And it's been very interesting because they've engaged the private sector in this through the Lifelines Council that they formed about 2 years ago, which is a group of all the utilities, the water companies, power, telecommunications, transportation, getting together quarterly to talk about the fragilities that they all share. And so those are some first steps in the U.S. to taking those kinds of planning and implementation efforts.
Funding is often a trigger. In the Clinton administration, there was a program called Project Impact, and cities could apply for it, and it was designed for people to do sort of preventative, pre-disaster kind of planning. Now it went away in the Bush years. I mean, everything went away after, all that kind of funding went away after 9/11 because all the focus was then on terrorism rather than national disasters. But we're seeing another interesting example at the international level, which is the UN agencies and the World Bank have really changed the way a lot of the disaster relief funding comes through. And it really changed between the two earthquakes in India, in Maharashtra and then in Gujarat. And they, in a sense, instead of just providing rebuilding and development money, they began to put some strings on that funding. And a lot of those strings had to do with sustainability and resilience and sort of community building. And so having that mantra at an international level has really been very important to sort of filter practices down sort of throughout a number of regions so that you're not just sort of replacing the same crummy buildings that are going to fall down again with the same crummy buildings that are going to fall down again. But there's been a real culture shift in the last decade. And I think that at an international level is very significant.
I'd like to say something in Jayant's presentation this morning was very interesting to me. When he talked about the quantification of demand and traffic demand and various service demands, and it's just that kind of sort of intersection of data, compilation, and analysis together laid over with a community's planning for disasters that helps city officials, I think, start to prioritize how they get more in tune with what needs to be done, both in advance of a disaster, at the point of the disaster, and through the recovery process. So it would be helpful maybe to hear from you about some of that work in relation to resilience.
Okay. So from my perspective, thinking about resilience, especially when we think about planning for the context of resilience, a fundamental difference that we look at is rather than planning for sort of the average case, you're really planning for extreme cases, right? And when you start to sort of do that kind of planning, the impact of doing that tends to be twofold, right? One is you might end up coming up with a cost and a budget that's higher on average. But it might mitigate for the extreme events, right? And so that is sort of from a from a modeling principle perspective, that's the big difference that sort of creeps into these sorts of models. And sometimes, as you had mentioned earlier, the budget issues do become a problem in the, especially when you start trying to convince somebody that they need to be spending a lot more money on average, right, because of an event that is a very low probability event, right? So one of the big challenges and interesting things that we've looked at is, what kind of simulation models should we think about and build out that makes clear what are the set of scenarios that we should actually be considering for planning, right? And of course, these sorts of models depend a lot on the kind of events that we are trying to work with, right? So we've had some experience, with New York City trying to plan for the H1N1 epidemic. In those sorts of contexts, we've focused more on looking at what are the pre and the post-disaster response that we should plan for in a way that it's going to be very robust. Because typically what happens in these sorts of situations is in your planning setting, you cannot be sure that the resources with which you're planning are actually going to be available when the event happens, right? So take the example of some work we did with FEMA where, depending on the path of the hurricane, around which there's a lot of uncertainty, it could turn out that the entire inventory that you're holding for a particular sort of response in terms of a fleet of emergency trucks are no longer available, or some parts of the roadway are no longer available. So going back to your question, I think from a modeling perspective, it's trying to build scenarios that are very evocative and which can help planners understand that they're important to plan for because it's a low probability tiger in some sense, is I think a very key issue.
How many of these modeling exercises actually result in standard operating procedures or a way in which to approach the rebuilding of a community post a disaster event? I mean, help me bridge the modeling part to actually something that takes place after an event. Yeah. I mean,
that's a very good question. In fact, this is a question I was going to ask some other members of the panel. I think it's a very difficult question from a temporal scale perspective, right? I would say that even today we are not very good with building models that give us a good idea of how communities emerge over a long period of time, right? Especially in terms of economic growth or social development. I mean, there have been several efforts in the community, both in physics and mathematics and computer science, to say, can we build agent systems that give us emergent behavior, in the short and the long term, right? Which provides us a view of how evolution of things happen. I think on those scales, at best, the way I think of the impact of models is maybe to provide some regulatory constraints on growth, right? Which then would have to sort of influence policies that get made, right? But it's hard to sort of implement it directly as a model itself.
I can say that's actually very interesting. Here in the Bay Area, we've been doing a lot of work, and actually throughout many states, disaster-prone states in the United States, using disaster scenarios as sort of discussion points and disaster exercises among cities and first responding communities. We have an interesting experiment underway here in the Bay Area right now where we're using the scenario of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and overlaying that on present-day Bay Area cities. And the Association of Bay Area Governments, my colleague Dana Breckwald is here, who's been working on this project for some time. And we've been working to convene 101 cities and 12 counties here in the Bay Area to talk about that very issue of Number one, if that earthquake were to happen today, and we're building from actually a lot of work that was done in 2006 at the 100-year commemoration of the earthquake, and we're looking at what region-wide efforts can these cities start to discuss together to build actually a resilience action plan for the Bay Area. And so out of the initial workshops that we've held, 3 topic areas have really risen to the top. Number one is post-disaster housing. And within these discussions among the cities about what we would see of perhaps up to 250,000 households affected by a large area earthquake, the research work of Mary Comerio comes right to the fore as we start to discuss, given those kinds of numbers, what would we do in the Bay Area? Where would people live in the short term? Would they decide to move to Idaho? Would they rebuild here? What would they do? The second thing that's really been very difficult for us to grapple with and has become part of a region-wide discussion is the restoration of utilities and the recovery of those interdependent systems. We're looking at some of the work that our colleague Lori Johnson is doing in San Francisco, helping us to look at an interdependency analysis among the lifelines and utilities just within San Francisco. And I can tell you, within those 49 square miles are some tremendously complicated and fragile systems, and that's only one city among that 101. The third piece that we're looking at is the governance and the issues of how political decisions and land use decisions are made in that post-disaster or post-disruption environment. So what we can do is sort of look at a scenario. It could be H1N1 flu. It could be airplanes crashing into significant landmark buildings in a community. It could be an earthquake. But no matter what the disruption is, there are cascading consequences that communities have to grapple with. And the other pieces in California, for example, that we start to rely on as our planning efforts is using the city's general plan, for example, as a way to start to envision what long-term land use development decisions communities can make and how people actually become part of the discussion. I've been very interested in how the urban science people who are here today think about civic engagement. It's very different in many ways at a macro level than the daily life of a city. And hearing about the buses going through the snow and the delivery times for the students at their home base with the Code for America folks shows us that there are many levels of community engagement, and starting to enliven and enrich that experience through technology, I think, is something that cities are really going to have to really jump on in the next few years.
Yeah, if I may add to this technology question, one very interesting project that we've done in IBM research back in India is a focus around this idea called the mobile web or the spoken web, right? And the reason why I think is particularly interesting is, post-disaster event, one of the biggest issues is information about what resources are available, right? And what are the needs for people, right? And it has a very spatio-temporal nature to that question. And one could imagine a scenario where maybe parts of the internet are down in a post-disaster event, right? And a mobile web, which is a spoken web, where people can speak into the web to create content, right? Especially as, in terms of requests or in terms of availability of resources, could provide a very quick way with low latency to bring, infrastructure into place that will provide us with useful information. Right? And, in the context of India, the mobile web has been used largely because the penetration of, PCs is not very high, whereas handheld devices is very high, right? So it just is a way of thinking about what are the different levels of technology, that are available that can be used to build a view of what is the information requirement of the moment.
So we've started to touch on it a little bit through this dialogue, but I just want to go back and make sure we touch on this a little bit more. when we talk about a resilience plan, what are we factoring into what that plan is? I mean, we've got a couple of bullets up here on the slides for the audience to see when it talks about health, housing, education, economy, and so forth. But can you just speak to and amplify a little bit, what exactly are we talking about in terms of a resilience plan? I've got this vision of some sort of tomb sitting on a bookshelf somewhere that someone pulls and starts to open up, and there's a series of action plans and so forth that we need to work our way through as a community, right? As a local government, as a regional government, as private industry, and so forth. But can you just speak to a little bit more about that?
Well, I can say a few things and then maybe get Mary to talk a little bit too. In the United States, we have a federal law called the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which requires all communities to engage in actual community dialogue about the physical risks that those communities face, and to develop plans to reduce risk, to build community networks, and to look at the long-term planning for disasters. As well, we have, as you say, many plans that sit on a shelf: emergency response plans, continuity of operations plans, this plan, that plan, the other plan. But truly, what we're seeing in the aftermath of very significant disasters is the necessity for communities to have connected in a strong way, so there's a high level of social dialogue, social capital, social networks, which become the engines for resilience and recovery. In California, for example, we have very, strict guidelines on the development of general plans, zoning ordinances, land use ordinances that really govern the way the built infrastructure is maintained and taken care of in ideal situations. And that becomes sort of the hub of physical recovery. But along with that comes the necessity for the social reconnection and the sort of social fabric of the community as well. And some recent work that was done by a professor, Daniel Aldrich, at Purdue University, he talks about the recovery of communities hit by very big catastrophes, and they come back once there has been very well-developed levels of social capital where the community is very well knit. But along with, having environmental plans that are part of community general plans in California, we also have safety elements as well. And together, these sort of plans that are called for by state and federal law become the, I guess, regulatory and policy framework for resilience. And so as we move forward with some recent presidential directives, the United States government is right now involved in developing a sort of new approach to resilience.
Well, I think that happens as you think about what's happening after the event. But if you try to think about what's happening before the event, it's sort of what does it mean? Whether you're the city of Berkeley or San Francisco or Los Angeles or any other place, you can really kind of take that checklist of kind of major functions in your community and say, okay, what does our healthcare system actually look like? How resilient is the healthcare system? And how quickly do we, how much of it do we think we need to function? How much is, what does our housing stock look like? And how much of that do we really need before people all just leave because they can't cope with being here because it's too difficult? How much, what is our utility infrastructure like? We actually did this on the Berkeley campus. In 1998, I ran a program called the Disaster Resistant University, and we looked at the vulnerability of all the buildings on the campus, all the infrastructure on the campus, but we didn't just look at it in sort of the physical sense. I mean, we did, but we looked at it beyond that. We said, well, what does it mean in terms of teaching? What does it mean in terms of research? What does it mean in terms of sort of business continuity for the university? And some interesting things emerged from this huge amount of data that we assembled. One was that we learned that things like what really mattered on the teaching side were the big classrooms, Because if you lost your big classrooms where you teach Econ 1 or Psych 1 or what we call in academic parlance the gateway courses, nobody can graduate because unless you teach them online, you're not going to be able to teach those courses. So not having the buildings where large classrooms are collapse is a pretty important thing to pay attention to. Similarly, you know, the reality of research universities is that they are largely funded by their research. And, you know, we had something like, you know, 75% of all the research dollars on the campus being worked on in a very small number of buildings, most of which were collapse hazards. And we've replaced or retrofitted all of those buildings. And it was sort of, it's that kind of thinking. What are the issues that affect your operations as a university? When we built a dining facility, they sort of realized that they would need to not only feed the students, but they would probably have to feed the whole Berkeley community. And so they made sure that that building was going to be operational after an earthquake. And it's that kind of thinking that's really about resilience. It's the university's goal was we don't want to lose a semester. You know, we don't want to have to shut for a semester. Once we shut for a semester, we're in really big trouble. So what can we do to reduce our downtime to 2 to 3 weeks? And these are all the activities that we had to do to do that. And you can take that same kind of planning and apply it at a citywide scale. What do we really need to do? It's not that we won't have damage and that we won't have to deal with it, but what do we do to make ourselves able to continue to function and to serve our citizens, to be here for them, for their job? I mean, it's not just citizens in housing, it's the business community in your city. I mean, really, none of us want Silicon Valley to leave. We really don't. And you know, we want IBM research here. We want all of the companies that are here to stay here. And they're not going to stay here if they can't function. So it's really important to the local economy that people think in these terms.
So I guess then given your comments then about the importance of the planning and some of the elements that are going in, one then has to turn their attentions to the barriers or the limitations of putting those plans together. I think the timeline as well is also important. I'm not quite sure I fully comprehend the timelines we're talking about in building these resilience plans. But, I mean, we've got a couple of points here for the audience to see on the slide about issues of implementation. We're talking about the political and social issues involved. We're talking in these times, of course, budgets as well, a portion to this type of activity, logistics of trying to bring, you know, Arietta, you said something like 100 stakeholders together to actually model what the 1906 earthquake would look like. Logistics of trying to pull all those different stakeholders together. So what are then the barriers to us pulling these plans together and then having them as actionable plans?
People talked earlier on some of the panels about public-private partnership. And about 2 years ago, there was a group of us working with the National Research Council on the very big challenges that government faces in bringing together both communities and the private sector into these discussions. And it was really focused on disaster resilience. And one of the things that we saw as sort of barriers to participation was the discussion about financing. Many communities, especially after a major disaster, very rarely before, look at the damage they have to reconstruct and the systems they have to restore, and they are really flummoxed by this. And so one of the things that's happened a lot in California, especially after the 1989 earthquake, is that communities started looking at how they could tax themselves, for example, to pay for some of these damages and to prevent future damages. So looking at financing has been a huge challenge. And I think that, especially within educational institutions and K-12 systems in the United States, our schools and other infrastructure systems really are aging. I mean, we heard about that in some of the other discussions. And we face a sort of infrastructure bill of billions upon billions of dollars just in California alone. And so looking at incremental upgrades, you know, has been the typical approach to improving that. So I think community engagement at a very serious level is one big challenge, as is financing.
Well, you know, there's also, though, I think you have to have a long time horizon. I don't think you know, we're more than 20 years out from 1989, and when you look back, we've accomplished a huge amount in terms of the improvement of our infrastructure, a change of mindset in many ways in all over California about safety issues. And so I think you need to kind of, without, you know, you can easily get depressed on this as a difficult topic, but I think you have to think in those kind of broader time frames. And also I think in the same way that we've heard from so many different people who've talked today about, you know, finding these efficiencies across areas. I think we haven't done enough of that in this area. And there are examples of companies, and I'll only mention the ones I know. I know there are more than these, but companies like Hewlett-Packard and others in Silicon Valley who have, you know, not only consciously paid attention to their own corporate campuses, but done things like provided loans so that people can, their employees retrofit their house, because it's occurred to them that they really want to keep those employees coming to work and not being at home, you know, dealing with a broken house. And so I think it's that kind of thinking that we can, you know, we can really build on this, both public-private, but also long-term. I mean, how long did it take us to get us to wear seatbelts in this country? I mean, it took a long time. It's taken a huge amount of time to sort of get people to be conscious about smoking and other kinds of health issues. I think that these, because they're, you know, high consequence, low probability events, I think we have to have a long time, we have to think on a long time frame, but we also have to think very proactively about taking advantage of opportunities that we might miss. And God knows there are plenty of missed opportunities. Just in terms of the technology, I went on Zillow and Trulia and a few others and looked up my house just out of curiosity. Well, first of all, half the information is wrong. It's got the size. I mean, there are all kinds of bad information on there, but that's okay. You could correct that. But there is no information about the soil conditions, about the school district, about all the kinds of safety issues that, from a seismic perspective, you could certainly use if you were going to be buying property in the Bay Area, and yet none of that exists on any public domain. Building ratings don't, I mean, we have the technical capacity to do all of this. We know how to do it in the scientific community, but it's not out there, and so we're missing lots of opportunities that I think could be very valuable.
I think about the issue in terms of risk, insurance, and finance. I think sort of the most difficult times we have is when there are risks that have not been insured adequately by society, either by private or public sector, right? And you know, the thing that is, to me, quite interesting is that we are beginning to increasingly get a better handle on some of the physical system models that allow us to get a better handle on this. For example, you know, one of the things these days that, you know, people are thinking about a lot is the impending change in climate, right? And the pathway in terms of what it has impacts on weather. So in fact, there are a lot of coastal areas that get impacted, right? So we might get actually a much better handle, you know, at a national level or a regional level in terms of, you know, characterizing these risks and the losses that are associated with it, right? And I think this is what you were alluding to. If these are made more publicly known and available, and it also is used to influence policy, right, regulatory policy, so that risks that are being taken in light of which are known risks, right? If you want to go build a house in the pathway of a hurricane that we know comes every year right on schedule, well, you're going to, it's a different story than, other types of risks, right, which at a community level might need to be handled, right? And this is where, maybe there are regulatory questions about what are the types of risks for which, private versus, government insurance might come into play.
That's actually a great point. And I want to say something maybe a little bit contrarian here. In the last 20 years, I watched the annual field poll, which is an opinion poll in California. The seismic safety issue has never, ever made the top 20 on the list of community concerns in the state. And so one of the things is that people, I think, are somewhat aware of disaster risks, but they don't really want to think about it. And so there's a real, I think, challenge to engage this kind of discussion, both at the policy level and within communities. Typically, people who are running for public office are on a 4-year time frame. They don't really have time to think in that longer time scale that Mary was talking about on disaster resilience and risk reduction. And so actually, we're really just on a just-in-time schedule with disaster safety in the main in the United States, for sure. We might look at countries like Holland, for example, which is, as a nation, they've taken a very progressive and aggressive approach to flood control that, of course, they have to because of the very, nature of the geographic and topological conditions there. But they have actually managed to muster the political will to say that I think the bottom line in the national government is that no person will die in a flood in our nation. And so they've taken extraordinary measures to prevent that. Politically, we haven't made decisions about disaster issues or sort of large disruptions that could really save lives. We don't really like to talk about it. And so overcoming that reluctance, I think, is a huge challenge. One of the things that I think Jennifer Palka talked about earlier is that the success of Apple marketing and stuff. And it's true, everybody in here is using an iPad or some great little Mac product. We have to, the Mac people have created a great desire for their product. We haven't created a desire sort of for community well-being or community sort of safety that would be sort of an analog to that kind of commercial endeavor. I don't know what the answer is to this, but we haven't quite hit it as a people.
So turning the attention a little bit, we've started to talk a little bit about the post-disaster planning. I mean, we'll skip across the actual emergency event itself and how a community, how a city, how a community reacts and does the immediate emergency management activities. Let's step forward a little bit now and post-disaster, trying to tie that back into the planning stage. So let's look at the assessments. So Jay, from a technology perspective, I mean, you represent a technology company, as do I. I mean, where can we start to employ technology that looks at more of better assessments of the impacts and using that technology to be the first inputs back into the planning stage? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess we discussed this. We touched upon this a little bit in the earlier discussion. And I think the earlier panel, had some interesting discussions about urban digitalization maps in terms of building these sorts of maps, right? So from a technology perspective, I think some of the emerging areas of spatiotemporal representation of urban systems and urban maps, provides us a very good start in terms of at least getting a handle on what might be the impact. once we identify specific disaster scenarios. And then the other direction, which I think is also potentially quite interesting, is if we look at the big data from the perspective of science data, right? Often today when we think of big data, we tend to sort of think more on the social web because much of the impetus for big data has come from there. But there's a tremendous amount of data that we collect from different types of Earth system sensors, right? Satellites, radars, LiDAR, all of these were referred to earlier, which are beginning to give us a better handle on understanding some of the variations in terms of extreme events that natural systems see, and how these extreme events might become more likely or less likely as specific evolutions in terms of climate, for example, might happen, right? So sort of these two directions, right? One, giving us better models for modeling potential extreme scenarios which are related to natural disasters, maybe coupled with a better understanding of our urban systems in terms of digitalization, and then sort of coupling that with loss estimation, right? These are probably two areas which are emerging, which I think are very promising from this perspective.
There's a really good example of exactly that from Christchurch, New Zealand. Christchurch has had 10,000 earthquakes in the last year and a half, 4 of which have been huge and quite significant, one of which destroyed their downtown. And they've had, because they're in so sort of where all the rivers come down off the mountains, they've had a lot of geological damage, a lot of lateral spreading and sinking and subsidence. So they have taken the GNS, which is their sort of USGS equivalent from the US, has taken all of that scientific data and really tried to do a scientific view of what the new sort of seismic outlook for the region is going to be. At the same time, they've taken all of the sort of city spatial data, and every piece of this is available on the web. And so they've zoned the city into areas where you absolutely cannot rebuild, and there's a buyout program for those, and then there's areas where you can rebuild. There are areas that are still under study for engineering reasons, but even within the sort of the green zones where you're allowed to rebuild, there are 3 categories, and within those categories there are differing kinds of rules about what you have to do to the foundation if you're going to rebuild there. Now, finance-wise, they had a national insurance scheme, so they're funding it with a national insurance scheme, but of course, as a result of this multiple events, they've actually had 13 insurable events that people can make claims against. They're having to rethink the whole national insurance. But I think it's an example of exactly that combination that you were describing, where it's using the scientific data, the engineering data, and all of the geospatial data to sort of think about how they're going to redevelop the city. And in addition, they've kind of used, I think, a lot of the social media. They had an enormous sort of planning event where thousands and thousands of people like typed in or came to meetings and gave commentary, and they've displayed and aggregated all of that kind of social commentary about how the city is going to rebuild. Now, none of these, it may sound more ideal than it is. It's a very difficult and tough process, but I think they have been using exactly the sort of cutting edge of this combination of modeling and planning to get to that point.
And, you can contrast that then, the difference between how a Christchurch in New Zealand rebuilds from a disaster to a Haiti rebuilds after a disaster. Certainly, examples in Haiti where they just simply lack the physical understanding of who owns the land, who has tenure on the property. This is one of the biggest barriers that is really stopping or limiting the amount, the speed of reconstruction in Haiti. simply nobody understands who owns what. There's no that consistent
there's no records left,
right.
because it all collapsed.
Yeah.
What records there were all
Right.
destroyed.
So these things tend to hold us back, but then how does one make the decision then to rebuild something that's more resilient versus simply rebuilding what was there in the first place? I mean, land is a very, the land itself is often a very interesting concept in different cultures about how they value the land as family rights and the importance of being attached to the land. So how do communities think about diversifying the use of the land from what was once maybe agriculture into something else?
Well, in Haiti, that's a pretty tough issue right now. I mean, in Haiti, but Haiti is sort of is really the tale of the tales, you know. It's almost hard to talk about that particular example because there's so many complex issues there that have to sort of be worked through. But in other developing countries, I mean, in Chile, which is really hardly a developing country, I would say more of an emerging economy, the earthquake and tsunami destroyed, you know, almost 400,000 housing units. The government has a huge program to rebuild about 250,000 low and moderate income units within a 4-year time frame. And they are really looking at this process as a sort of a community engagement, community involvement process. It's sort of local economic development. The choices of like who does the building is that the community selects the builders from a panel of 3 or 4. I mean, there's been an incredible process at sort of trying to build some democracy as in addition to building better, stronger, safer buildings. And that's it's a very interesting example of really taking the opportunity to change things at a sort of social sense in addition to in a sort of physical sense.
If I may, let's turn the panel open to the floor, and let's see if we've got any questions or comments based on the materials that we've just been reviewing. Again, we've tried to frame the conversation into 3 lenses, really: the pre-disaster resilience planning, the post-disaster, and then the technology lens. So the gentleman in the corner there, I've got a lady over here, and I've got a gentleman up front here. So let's see what we can do.
Hi, David Morley from the American Planning Association. I didn't hear anyone on the panel commenting on more recent pre-event, post-disaster planning efforts, maybe most notably in Florida and the coastal counties that are now required to prepare pre-event plans. Now, we haven't seen any of the pre-event planning processes tested by a catastrophic event yet. And in full disclosure, the American Planning Association is working on an update to something that's colloquially called the Green Book, which is planning for post-disaster recovery. And I'm part of a much larger project team that is really struggling with, has the state of the art really advanced in the past 15 years or so? And we want to believe that it has, but then when we go out looking for these case examples of what happened in specific situations, I don't know. I would say that in my very limited perspective, and this is my personal perspective, is that I'm not sure we're seeing a great advancement, and I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could comment on maybe some more recent developments and a greater emphasis on pre-event planning for events, and are you optimistic that that is going to bear fruit, especially maybe with the emphasis on process-oriented planning versus trying to predict some specific event and then prepare for the effects of that event?
I think we all probably could have a few words on that one. About the Florida situation, there was a state law passed about 12 to 13 years ago to require coastal communities to have post-disaster development plans in place before the next hurricane meeting every year. Very few cities put them together. 5 cities were funded by special federal funding. They did do this fabulous, lovely planning work. And then the state of Florida has nullified the program recently, which was very discouraging.
Why did they nullify the program? What was the reason behind that?
As when I used to work at the city of Berkeley, I used to say, I can't answer that question at this time. And I think
Very
really,
nice.
I think really it's a combination of political and financial issues. California had, and actually the American Midwest has done some, I think, heroic pre-event flood planning. And Cedar Rapids, Iowa emerges as a sort of heroic community in the United States on disaster stuff. The communities hit in the American South by the horrible tornadoes in Missouri are also emerging as sort of recovery, champions. But generally what's happening is that, with the exception of perhaps the West Coast in the United States, communities are not doing pre-event disaster recovery planning. There are exceptions, I think, on the West Coast. So, I mean, the American Planning Association has been an amazing champion for this work, but the work is very hard for communities to take on before the disaster. It's sort of like, are we all going to the gym every day and running 5 miles? And that, I think, is the analogous situation. Colleagues.
Yeah, I have trouble commenting on Florida, too, because I would say very negative things. So I should probably just not. Florida is a state that banned smoke detectors in their building code because the real estate interest said it would add money to the cost of a home. A smoke, think about it. The politics in Florida are very strange. So I agree with Arietta. I think there is not a lot of work on this yet nationally. There really hasn't been. I frankly think it's going to take another very large event in the country. I mean, after, Katrina was perceived by many as a real outlier. It wasn't. Somehow Americans didn't take Katrina to heart in a way that I would have expected. And I think it's going to take another very large event where people begin to realize, A, the federal government is not going to be there to bail them out, and B, they don't have any insurance, and they're kind of on their own. And I think that when people start to see that happen, I think there will, there may be incentives to begin that planning process, but I think it's going to be hard until an example is so visible.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think there have been quite a few developments in the last decade, especially from a perspective of building tools and models that would help pre- and post-disaster planning, right? Maybe I'll just give you a few examples. The most recent is probably the work that's going on in Rio, pretty much focused on trying to make the city a lot more resilient to impacts of flooding in face of the fact that they're going to host both the Olympics and the World Cup. Although I'd bet they care about one more than the other. And part of this, I think, is possible because the kind of modeling that's possible in terms of the resolution of how weather systems move, right? To the extent of knowing resolution maybe 6 to 24 hours ahead of time at a kilometer by kilometer level, right? Of course, it's not perfect. There's still uncertainty, but it allows, if you get this sort of information, it allows you to plan for these sorts of events, right? So I think there is stuff that has happened that allows us to plan better. Another example which I thought was actually quite interesting is some work we did with FEMA, largely focusing on building very robust and resilient post-disaster logistic plans for disaster recovery. Especially keeping in mind that most of these plans have to be still viable even if a certain fraction of your resources get knocked out. And I think these sorts of approaches and models are useful. And another example is with the Fire Protection Agency, right? They're increasingly in a situation where every year they have to plan for putting aside budget and resources, in terms of firefighters and helicopters and other sorts of fleets of vehicles, to sort of understand, how much should they put aside, how much money should they put aside. And at least from a modeling perspective, we are at a much better position today in terms of, taking these sorts of constrained budgets to still come up with a plan that will handle, which would cover a much larger number of scenarios, even in the worst case, right? So so from the examples that we've seen and we've worked on, I feel that there has been a lot of progress in terms of what are the things that we could provide to enable decision makers to use.
Colin, the lady at the back had a question. I don't think I've got anything to add to that previous discussion.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Kroll. I'm at the Fisher Center for Real Estate at Haas here. But I've also had my opportunities to work on disaster response, and particularly earthquake preparedness, over a number of decades. So I have a few comments. One is that, I don't know about the last 10 years, but if one looks at the last 30 years or so, I think huge progress has been made in California in terms of preparedness. And it's not just in the physical buildings, but it's in the information available to households, the ways that communities address this. Maybe the post-disaster is a different story. A couple of other responses to what has been said here. Not too much was said about private business. Mary did bring up what HP was doing. But the large businesses in the Bay Area have done a lot in terms of disaster preparation, planning for responding to emergencies. And I guess what I don't know is how closely they're drawn into all of the exercises and planning that the public sector does, but they seem like a large resource to me. I think one of the challenges in all this is that, you figure out what to do. You do get a number of players moving, but how do you maintain that focus and keep things moving along, keep things up to date, continue to incorporate new technology. And one thing that I've observed, again, in private businesses is learning from small events. And I guess I'd be interested to know to what extent that's happening. I mean, examples are, we had a safety emergency at Haas where the UC has this whole communication system set in to warn people if there's anything dangerous going on and so forth. At Haas, it totally did not work until an hour after the event was over. I mean, this was something that ended up not too disastrous, but it was clearly a learning opportunity. Another example is when a truck ran into part of the approach to the Bay Bridge, and that whole system was down for a while. And these large companies had systems set up. They called their employees. They said, work at home. Don't come into work if you're in the East Bay. So those seem like opportunities to keep the focus moving.
Any comments on those?
Just good points.
Arietta? Okay.
Yeah, I think they're good points. I believe, in IBM, during the H1N1 scare, there's quite a bit of effort put into business continuity. And I think it's a very good point. if you're able to aggregate all the practices across maybe private industry in an area, who might be quicker at the adoption of new technologies, maybe it provides sort of the entire community useful tools. I think that's a very good suggestion.
The only comment I've got from a business continuity perspective is lessons learned from terrorist attacks. When from an ESRI perspective, knowing where all our employees are at any one time, from the location of their cell phones and things like that, is something that we're able to track. For the safety of our employees. So that's another example. So.
Hello, my name is Andres Gomez, a graduate student in applied mathematics from Arizona State University, and I was wondering that you've commented about natural disasters mainly, and I was wondering if you could comment on social crisis also that might not be so sudden, but we've seen, for example, in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, the crime wave, which have been probably will have long-time consequences, and the Arab Spring and things like that. And
I can mention an interesting study that was done at the Harvard Kennedy School by some of my colleagues there, and they did a lot of aggregation of cell data and the nodes of communication among people after major disruptions. And they looked at some natural disasters, some social and political disruptions. And what they saw, I think, was what was pretty surprising to me, and probably not so surprising to people in the tech world, was that, first of all, traffic, of course, was way up. And the observations on social media, people were tracking cell data and then, sort of monitoring social media. And the way people were connecting in a very significant and, I think, sort of crucial way was evident. And people had many more outlets and ways to connect. And so technology in that situation was really a social weaver for people. And the political, when we talk about emergent systems and emergent sort of trends among people, I think that we are connecting in new ways, and that we use technology to very good purpose in disasters, especially, I mean, some of the things that we saw after the Haiti earthquake on remote sensing, and people all around the world were convened, for example, to people in the engineering world were given information about buildings that were destroyed and where to send in rescue crews. You Shahidi did a lot of amazing work in a number of disruptive situations to, number one, connect people in distress with support. So I think that these are new tools that give us just-in-time support and response. So I think there's more to be learned here, and the new ways of using this, especially for government. I'm really happy that the Code for America people exist, because I think they're taking totally new and breakthrough ways of looking at problem solving and connecting with people that I think is illuminating for local governments and national governments we see in the Middle East.
Just a quick comment on your question. The UN has actually a special division on post-conflict and post-disaster, and the two branches kind of talk to each other, but there's also hugely different kinds of issues. I mean, whether it's social conflict or war or refugee, I mean, you can have people displaced for generations. So there's not this issue of going back, or there isn't an issue of rebuilding something, but really enormous changes. And so there are some things that the natural disaster world can help with that, but there are also things that are very different and need a sort of a different kind of technology and attention because of the very long-term consequences.
And I think we're starting to see a couple of examples now where, you mentioned the Arab Spring. You can probably add to that, the riots in London last year. These are events that did catch governments off guard to various degrees. And now those governments and law enforcement agencies are now looking at social media, being able to track other indicators of change within the population as a sort of keeping the pulse, if you like. It's not necessarily a surveillance community being established, but using social media, using other ways in which they can track predictors, indicators of change and indicators of potential unrest in the future as a way of, being able to control that, but also being able to protect other parts of the citizens. In the UK, you've seen some quite harsh sentences being brought down on individuals convicted for their participation in the riots in London last year, all down to their activity in social media. So it's interesting to see how that social media and environment has been turned around as now a tool for law enforcement to be able to monitor the urban environment. Do we have time for one more question, Colin, or are we?
We have time for the break.
Okay. There was one gentleman here. I don't know if you have a quick question or a comment.
Yeah, I think I have a good question that'll end it. My name's Ken Kratz, and I graduated in architecture from the college here in the 70s. And a quick question is, do the people, I've read so much about megacities that have really changed the nature of cities since I graduated. These huge megacities, there's lots of them around the globe now. Does the influx of all these people have been displaced through the development and things, that this influx of large populations into these huge cities, does that fall under the category of this discussion of disasters? I know it's not a natural disaster, but the incidence of all this influx of people with these shanty towns and the I assume pollution problems, they're associated with their watershed and sanitation, all that. I know it's a huge thing, probably too big a question, but I am curious, does it fall under this sort of panel discussion, or is it really something else? Thank you.
I don't think it wasn't part of the original remit we were discussing, but it's an interesting theme that, when you look at disasters, you look at emerging problems and challenges for cities, these are now, themes that contribute to challenges and problems down the road. It may be something we want to consider in another panel for another time, Yuri. I don't know if that's a good idea, but that's just my comment from where I sit.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it is a huge issue. It is actually even a huge disaster issue when you think about some of those megacities are in fairly vulnerable places. But in addition to that, just the issues of climate change and sustainability and energy and all of those things are a huge issue when you get that kind of agglomeration of population.
So I think, I think what we will wrap up the panel. We're going to go into a break. I hope the topic of the panel has created some ideas and some interest for you to approach the members of the panel and chat further over the break and over the course of the next day or so. Please join me in thanking the panel.